Hello, readers, and there's Shannon. Yay, hurrah. Hey, I'm Miwa Messer. I am the producer and host of Poured Over, Barnes & Noble's podcast, and with me are Emily St. John Mandel, the author of Sea of Tranquility, among other books, and Shannon DeVito, who's head of books for Barnes & Noble. So before we get to the good stuff, a couple of things. There are going to be lots of spoilers in this conversation. If you are not prepared for spoilers, well, it's a book club discussion and we are going to go there. So I just want to give you guys a heads up there. Harry, would you launch the poll, please, so our attendees can hang out and answer some questions? I'm just sort of curious to see what you guys think. Who's your favorite character? Is this the first one of Emily's books that you've read? And also, have you seen Station 11 yet on HBO Max? So just take your time, answer those. We'll give you a few minutes. And what else am I looking for? Oh, right, the Q&A module. If you have questions, we're not going to hold them till the end, so please feel free to use the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. Drop your questions in there, and we'll be taking a look. You can use the chat, but really the Q&A module is much better. So if you could do that, we'd really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to see Emily. I'm so excited to see Shannon. But before we do anything, Shannon, why did we pick Sea of Tranquility for the BNN Book Club pick?
So I read this a while ago and I just reread it before this discussion and loved it even more the second time. But after the first time I read it, not only Emily, have I loved your work forever, but this really, the echoes of your previous books with The Glass Hotel and Station 11, the influences that you really thread throughout with family, nature, music, the pandemic, the fact that it's genre bending, it's just a tour de force that I knew our readers would love and was ripe for discussion on so many different levels and layers. We had to pick it for book club.
Thank you so much.
It was the perfect one for May.
I so appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to jump in for 2 seconds because I see people saying, is this recording going to be available later? Yes, on the BNN YouTube channel. So if you don't want to have the book spoiled, by all means, go ahead, finish the book, come back. There will be a recording. I think we pop it up later today. So there's that. But I also want to add one thing to what Shannon said is, because also I've been reading Emily for quite some time too, and this felt like your most personal book to date. And I'd really actually like to start there because autofiction is not a thing. I mean, this is your 6th book. Mm-hmm. Autofiction is not a thing that you had played with until now.
It's true. At the same time, when I think about autofiction, which, for anybody unfamiliar is, of course, autobiographical fiction, I've started to think of it as fiction that's just slightly more obviously based on the life of the writer. So, I look back to, say, Miranda in Station 11, who is one of my favorite characters. She's pretty close to me in a lot of ways. The condition of creating art around the margin of your day job. Well, that was Station 11. I was an administrative assistant in a cancer research lab, writing my book on the side. She's from the island that I'm from. I really didn't change very much in that sense. I think I've changed a lot, but there were elements of myself and Vincent too, in the Glass Hotel. So writing the character of Olive Llewellyn in Sea of Tranquility, she's much more personal in the sense that there are actually real conversations that I really had, which, to circumvent half the questions in the Q&A, people really say those things to me on tour, like verbatim. So in that sense, it was much more personal. In the sense also of parenting a young child in a pandemic, that's a life experience I don't need to have again. Which that was a lot. And yeah, the condition of being the author of Station 11, in a pandemic is something I got into there with her. She's on the road in the service of a pandemic novel as a real pandemic breaks out.
And you've said that, and you said this to me actually on Poured Over. It's not that you're not grateful for the experience. It's just you need to process what's
absolutely happened. Yeah, it's a lot. It's really a lot. Yeah.
So can we talk about world building for a second? Because I mean, obviously you have blown up genre in a different way here, which we all appreciate. But you've built 3 separate worlds that come together. And the New Yorker has this great line. I am totally stealing this line from the New Yorker, but it's awesome. The Mandel cinematic multiverse.
I have been using that line in every live event. Like, please, everybody listening, could you spread that into the world? Because I kind of love it.
Make it a thing.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
Okay, but let's talk about how you built the world of Sea of Tranquility and how it folds back actually onto Glass Hotel, because there are a couple of questions in the Q&A module right now, but it's you don't have to have read Glass Hotel first. I will say that now.
I think that's true. Yeah, all my books stand on their own.
Mm-hmm.
So, Sea of Tranquility, I realized pretty early on that it was going to be a time travel book because that was just something I kind of always wanted to do. And when I started writing this book in earnest, it was the spring of 2020 in New York City. So, like, everything was terrible. Honestly, that time, that atmosphere of death and the constant sirens and just the horror of it was so intense and so profound. And it gave me this feeling like everything's terrible. I'm just going to write whatever I want. You could insert an expletive in there if you wanted. So yeah, I was like, I'm just going to go for it and write a time travel novel. And so then I had to think, well, what are the time periods going to be? I wanted the 1912 timeline because I'm kind of fascinated by an ancestor of mine, Newell St. Andrew St. John, and Edwin is a very, kind of slightly disguised version of him. Another time period that fascinates me is the spring of 2020. Well, particularly February 2020 in New York City. And I think the reason I'm obsessed with that particular month is because there was this kind of society-wide mass failure of imagination where, and this is a line that recurs in the book, we knew what was coming. We're not actually idiots. Like we could see what was approaching on the news with this terrible new outbreak in China and then Italy and elsewhere. But we somehow didn't believe it or like somehow didn't think it could happen to us. And it was just a weird cognitive dissonance of, on the one hand, being pretty breezy about it. Like, oh, yeah, that virus is obviously already here. And on the other hand, doing all the dumb things like you shouldn't do in a pandemic, like dropping your kid off at school or, crowded subway trains, hugging strangers, choir practice in unventilated basements, like the dumb moves that we should have known better. So yeah, I was fascinated by that point in time. And then I remember thinking, wait, I already have this whole cast of characters who are very plausibly in New York City in the spring of 2020 because I had just written The Glass Hotel. So it was partly that, just that, I had these characters waiting in the wings. It was partly an instinct that I think has come into play every time I've drawn two books together, like linked them with characters, which is, I think, just a fundamental wish for some kind of order in the universe. Just like, could we pull everything together, like make this one big story? And partly it can be a really interesting opportunity, or there is an interesting opportunity in bringing characters across from one book into the other in terms of character development, where in The Glass Hotel, we don't spend that much time with Morella, Vincent's best friend, because we can't. That, velocity is a core value of mine as a writer, and I just can't spend that much time with secondary characters. So, but I really liked her. I was interested in her and wanted to know what happened next. So it was interesting to bring her into this new book and just get more of her.
Hey, Shannon, do you have a favorite character from Sea of Tranquility?
It's Olive.
Yeah.
And before I get to why, I do want to say it was such a just pleasant like spark of a surprise to have the characters come back, because it's not necessarily like you said, all of your books you can read them standalone and you don't have to read all of them, but the experience is so much more enriched when you have this cast of characters you've already developed a relationship with, and then you stumble upon them like you would in a coffee shop, or it's just they appear in the perfect place at the perfect time. It felt so natural for them to be introduced into this world. So I love that. And I am interested if it's something you're looking to do in future works. But so personally, just with the cast of characters, I really connected with Olive and just her reflections on the pandemic, not only, but also reflections on her work, that she had suddenly found this parallel world where people were reading her novels. And I think that it's just, for so many people in their careers, whether it be writing or something else, there can be these kind of labors of love and works of passion. And sometimes it's done in a silo, and it's not maybe appreciated in a way that it could be in alternate timelines. So personally, I loved Olive. But Emily, I'm curious if there's a character that you really liked writing the most of the cast in this book.
Gaspery. I really liked him.
Yeah.
You know, he's a little bit hapless.
Yeah.
He's very much like Jeevan in Station 11, actually, now that I think about it. Yeah, there's something kind of poignant and moving about a character who means well and is not great at their job somehow. Like, you know, a great person who's kind of imperfectly competent. I like writing people like that.
And the name was so fitting. I don't know. Gaspery feels like the perfect name for someone who is kind of hapless and but threads everyone together.
Right. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have our poll results too, and actually Olive comes in as the audience's favorite character.
It's so fraught with autofiction. I'm so glad.
Yeah. and Gasperi is a close second, and Edwin, who I'm fond of Edwin, and I want to spend a couple of minutes on Edwin because he is so hapless, but he's just a lovely, well-meaning guy. But he does set us up. He sets us up for the rest of the book. But Edwin comes in a distant third. So I think that tells us that I'm standing under a tree apparently with Edwin, waiting for something to happen. But here's the thing. So Edwin is based on your relative, but also he sets us off in sort of a very quiet, contemplative way, which is slightly different for you because, I mean, you tend to open stories and you really leap right into them. So can we talk about the start of Station 11 for you? I mean, obviously the autofiction piece is a huge part of it, but I'm talking about the physical writing of this story and the connecting of these three wildly divergent characters.
Yeah, absolutely. The start of Station 11 or Sea of Tranquility?
Sorry, Sea of Tranquility.
I'll talk about either.
Okay.
Yeah, the start of Sea of Tranquility was probably 2 or 3 months before the pandemic. And I'd started working on these autofiction fragments about an author on tour. I wasn't sure if I'd ever do anything with them because, to be candid, it seemed kind of high risk. Like, that's the kind of work that can come across as like, guys, it's super hard to be an author on tour, which, oh my God, is there a more privileged position in the entire world than being an author on tour? Like, that's literary lottery. You know, it's amazing to get to do that. And I feel such gratitude for getting to do that. At the same time, people say such interesting things to me on tour. And yeah, the word interesting is doing some heavy lifting there. So, you know, 99% of interactions are great. 1% are surreal. I wanted to write about those surreal moments I'd had. So that was the beginning, you know, just writing these fragments. I wasn't sure if I'd do anything with them. And then the pandemic hit. And I decided to write a time travel novel, kind of as a project to keep myself sane. And I thought, well, maybe it'd be interesting to keep those autofiction fragments, but filter them through a kind of sci-fi lens. So yeah, that was how it started. And then the rest of the project sort of developed out from there.
So we have someone asking too, who are your influences that inform the science fiction aspects of your writing? And it's Brad Braithwaite. I hope I'm saying your name right, Brad. But and a couple of folks said, yeah, we would like to hear that answer.
Yeah, sure. You know, that was all I read when I was a teenager. So there was a ton of Asimov, but also I think a lot of more obscure writers who I don't remember their names. I wish I'd kept a record, but I was just always reading sci-fi anthologies, you know, all the moon colonies and the androids and time travel and everything else. And that was something that really spoke to me when I was, I want to say I was like 15 through 17 or 18 that was all I read. And then, you know, my reading interests broadened over time, but it's just always been a genre that I've enjoyed. I think of it as the genre where imagination goes the furthest somehow, where, you know, even if you're writing like realist fiction, you do have to invent a world, but there's just that thing of like inventing a much more extreme world, or inventing a world in a much more extreme, comprehensive way with sci-fi that's always just really appealed to me.
Is there, especially with this idea of the moon colony and the different timelines in this book, did you land on the title relatively quickly because of your background and because of what you were building, or did that take some more time?
It was pretty quick. I have a really hard time with titles, and I don't always love them after they've gone to press. But yeah, I think originally it was just called Gaspery. And then I hit upon Sea of Tranquility. I was like, oh, that's kind of elegant. I'll go with that.
Very elegant.
Okay, and speaking of our guy, Gasperi, because this is one of the things I didn't get to ask you, Emily, when you were on the show, because we obviously didn't want to spoil things
Right.
on Pub Date. But when did you know what Gasperi had done, that he was the anomaly and that he had kicked off? You had to have known relatively early in the process.
You'd be surprised.
Oh,
No,
seriously?
It was a total add-on. I'd finished the book and I was like, it's just missing something. And I was like, wait, what if he is the violinist? So, yeah, it came like it was embarrassingly late. I literally had a draft that I was about to send to my agent. She was like, hold on, I can add this whole other thing that ties the whole thing together.
Oh, I'm so glad you did, because when I realized he was the violinist, I had a moment. I also found a note to myself, and I'm not, because I read your book a couple of times, I'm not sure when I made this note, but I have a little Gasperi arrow priest from the first section. I'm like, I don't know when I did that. That may have been.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish I had dated it.
Right. That was early on. Yeah.
Okay, but let's talk about something that Gasperi says to his sister, because he's a time traveler. He's been given the rules of time travel. He's been told exactly what not to do. And of course, he's Gasperi. He doesn't follow the rules. But he says to Zoe, it's like you warned me, he said quietly. You said the job required a lack of humanity. And it does. It does. That's a heartbreaking moment. Can we get into that for a minute?
Yeah.
Because that's a big moment for our guy.
It's a big moment. Here's what Gasperi is grappling with. His job is to go back in time, investigate things, but not disrupt the timeline. And what that means in practical terms is that if he's talking to a guy who's going to drown next Tuesday, he can't warn him. So morally, and even almost practically speaking, that's the same thing as declining to pull a drowning man out of the water. So you have to make that choice to let a death happen. And that's what he's talking about. And it's the reason why I would personally not be a good time traveler. I think I would do what Gasperi did every time.
There's another piece of a section that goes into, you describe bureaucracy as an organism, and that its main priority is self-preservation, which just hit so hard for me, especially in the last few years, just with the reaction of, bureaucracy in some ways kind of has a personality and a life of its own. So I'm just curious how you landed on that sentence. Just still sticks out to me all the time, but how you landed on something so profound within this larger framework of kind of character layers.
It's just something I think about, that, every bureaucracy I've ever been involved with, and we've all been involved with something. I used to sell clothes for Club Monaco, or I worked for a university in Manhattan. They are like these self-protecting organisms in a strange way. And, people work in the service of them, like they are a collection of people. But there's something about the bureaucracy that takes on a life of its own. And I do feel like, it's pretty cynical to say that that's always the primary function, but it is always a function. Yeah, it's just an idea I find interesting.
I want to come back to the simulation hypothesis.
Sure.
And Gasperi, because simulation hypothesis, it builds off of what you were just talking about in terms of the bureaucracy and systems and organisms sort of taking care of themselves. But would you give us your definition of the simulation hypothesis?
Sure. It was the only way I could come up with to make time travel work. So the problem with time travel narratives is they tend to create a loop. So suppose I leave this Zoom meeting, step into a time machine, and it takes me to 1910. Then I was always going to leave the Zoom meeting, step into the time machine, and go to 1910 and go around and around and around. So I thought, well, maybe a way to solve this problem would be to layer on a whole nother level of weirdness. And that's the simulation hypothesis, which for anyone who's unfamiliar, it's just this fun internet rabbit hole you can go down. It's the idea that all of our reality is a simulation. And that was a way for me to just kind of solve the time travel problem for myself was by having a character in the year 2400 at the Time Institute say, and I'm paraphrasing, but something to the effect of, we don't understand why time travel works as well as it does. We don't understand why it doesn't always create an infinite loop. We think the reason why the timeline seems to repair itself and the reason why time travel works at all is that perhaps all of reality is a simulation. That's evidence of that. So yeah, that was why it needed to be in the book and the only way that I could write a time travel novel.
Okay, I want to work in a question from Cassandra Nags. I love the way you interweave historical fiction elements and science fiction elements in your work, treating both with the same sense of respect. How do you view the slow dissolution of traditional genre distinctions and its effect on the book world as a whole?
It's been wonderful. Honestly, it's something I'm so happy about. So, my first novel was published in 2009, and it took a couple of years to sell. And during the period when it wasn't selling, when it was being rejected by every publisher in the tri state area, like all over the country, a lot of the rejection letters from publishers came down to, we don't know where we would shelve this. What I heard a lot was, we don't know how we would market a book that's both literary fiction and detective fiction. And what's wonderful about our current moment is that's no longer a thing. Station 11 was successful by any measure, and that was literary fiction and sci-fi. And The Glass Hotel was literary fiction and a ghost story and crime fiction. And this new one is literary fiction and sci-fi and a detective story, I think. So I feel like that just makes it a much more exciting landscape, not just for writers, but for readers. And I have often found myself a bit frustrated by the way we have had a tendency to kind of silo our books into these very rigid genre categories. I saw it the most vividly with Station 11, where readers would come up to me and say, you know what, I've heard great things about your book, but I actually only read sci-fi. So no offense, I'm not reading your literary fiction. Or conversely, same book, other readers would come up and say, heard good things. I only read literary fiction. I'm just not a big sci-fi fan. Like, no offense. And it was just like, guys, it can be more than one thing. So yeah, it's a nice moment in that way.
It is. It's a book is a book is a book, and it can be so many different things to different audiences. And we're seeing that, across all sorts of genres with nonfiction memoirs. And there's these different layers of world building that's happening across so many different subjects that it's a really cool time to, I'm sure, be a writer, but also to be a reader, discovering these books and kind of, maybe someone who thinks they're a literary fiction person picks this up and gravitates towards the sci-fi aspect because they never would have picked that up before, and they can open a whole new world into science fiction writing.
Yeah,
which is cool.
definitely. And like for myself, I've been forced to confront my own biases as a reader, where I think in the past I would have said, if there's one genre that really doesn't interest me, it's horror. Like, it's just not my thing. Dan Shawn's novel Ill Will is one of my favorite books. And I think it's a horror novel in a lot of ways. It is so good. I've read it twice and I never do that. Yeah. So it's interesting to realize, I have my own biases around these things.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to lose sight of one really big piece here. I know we're sort of dancing around genre a little bit, and I'm personally delighted that everything is just coming together as well as it is. But aren't we just looking for story? I want a good story, and I trust you enough that if you're going to bring time travel into it, I'm just going to let you go and I'm going to follow you. That's how it is for me. I'm not a big sci-fi reader, but I was okay going to the moon with you. I was okay traveling through time.
Thank you. But that's an interesting point because we're looking for a good story, but a lot of readers are also very specifically focused on beautiful prose.
Mm-hmm.
And they think they won't find that if they're going to the moon, because that hasn't always been the same thing. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. So that's another kind of interesting aspect of this, that I think we get better stories in our literary fiction if literary fiction writers embrace all the other genres, just bring more plot into it. I also think sometimes we get better prose if it flows the other way. If detective fiction is influenced by like literary fiction.
I mean, through each of these three sections, you're talking about the world ending for each of these characters. And the world ends in different ways, but I mean, Olive comes out and says it flat out. What if the world is always ending?
That was my Station 11 lecture. I gave it to all. Yeah. Yeah. That was a line of inquiry I found really interesting in thinking about Station 11. Because with that book, I did this epic promotional tour, and then I did lectures about the book for years all over the US. And what I found myself thinking and talking about a lot is like, why are we so interested in post-apocalyptic stories? And there's this pervasive idea. Well, there are a lot of ideas about why. The one I heard the most often is that it has to do with the climate crisis, that we channel our natural anxiety about the state of the world into an appetite for post-apocalyptic books. The counter argument is, when have we ever felt like the world wasn't ending? And what I find myself thinking about this conversation I had with my mom a few years ago, where she talked about how guilty she and her friends had felt bringing children into the world in the late 70s and early 80s in Western Canada. And it's like, try to imagine a more tranquil moment in human history. Like, you can't. But that was the height of the Cold War, and there was a fear of nuclear annihilation. And that just kind of, it made me think, like, we always believe it's the end of the world. But beyond that, maybe it always is the end of the world. To bring my mom into it again, which I do a lot. We went to this a few years ago. She visited me in New York, and we went to this exhibit at the Morgan Library. It was this really cool exhibition of illuminated manuscripts. There was one in particular that caught my eye. It was this little book put together by an 11-year-old Elizabeth I for her stepmother. And my mom made an interesting observation. She said, the book was not written that long ago in the grand scope of human history. It's about 500 years old. But the world in which that book was written is long since gone. And you can't point to any cataclysm that ended that world, but it ended nonetheless. And it follows that a new world is always ending around us. I think usually so subtly and so slowly, you can't really understand it except in retrospect, unless some unexpected event happens. And what I find myself thinking about on this topic is this incredible op-ed by Arundhati Roy that came out at the beginning of the pandemic. She said, a pandemic is a portal. A pandemic, or maybe other historical events, can, serve the same function, is this portal that just whooshes you from one world into the next in a very rapid way. And I think that's the moment that we're living through now, where things have changed really quickly around us. And yeah, we haven't quite seen the shape of our new world yet. But yeah, I love that idea. The world's always ending, and there's always a new world rising up to take its place.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the new world coming in. Shannon, do you have a favorite moment from Sea of Tranquility?
That's tough,
I
because
know.
there were a lot that were poignant at different points of when I was reading it, and also the second time I read it. Honestly, and what was interesting is to hear that it was added at the end. It's is when you realize that he is the anomaly, and that those threads being pulled together and woven in that way. That was a beautiful way. And one of my favorite books in the last few years too, and I think there was a Bruce in the chat that also mentioned this, was Cloud Cuckoo Land. And the threads in that book that really come together at the end, that make everything that come before it that much more meaningful and poignant. I think for me, that was probably the most special part. There's some fun parts in the time traveling cat and things like that, but I think that realization for me was my favorite. What about you, Miwa?
Oh, don't make me choose. It
See,
really,
it's hard.
no. Honestly, it was when I realized that Gasperi was the violinist and that his eyes had changed. And that was where really everything, and also when we meet Edwin at the very end, and he has been really changed by the war. That was pretty powerful. Olive, I'm very fond of her, and I sort of clung to every word that came out of her mouth.
Thank you.
But And especially when she sprints out of the hotel and leaves her suitcase. And if you travel as much as some of us do, that is probably more unimaginable than time travel, honestly.
Like, that's like a
Bolting and
limb.
leaving your suitcase.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
does that. So those are sort of the three big touchstones for me. I do want to work in a audience question here because it's interesting. We have a bunch of people who want to know, was the glitch caused by the time paradox or a simulation? And I don't know if we actually
Sorry,
have that
allergies.
answer. Oh, no,
Uh,
I get it.
it was caused by the simulation.
Okay.
If you imagine the simulation as a malfunctioning computer program, that was the glitch.
Okay. Thank you for that. Emily, what's your favorite moment from the book?
It's a great question. It might be the moment when Gaspari goes into the time travel chamber and his sister's like, okay, you know your cat? He's like, yeah, he's napping at home. He's like, your cat's a time traveler for 1985. He's just like, what? Like, I think that might be my favorite moment.
Fair enough. I'm not really a cat person, I should admit.
I am.
Yeah, I know. Luckily, Shannon represents. She represents.
Cat lady.
She has a couple of great cats. I want to riff off of something that Shannon just said about the Anthony Doerr as well, because that was kind of a surprise. But you've talked about how David Mitchell was a big influence on you in Cloud Atlas, which is a fabulous book. But he's not your only influence. And I just want to bring Norman Mailer into the conversation for a second.
Absolutely.
Because I think Mailer is going to surprise, I mean, it certainly surprised me when you and I were talking about it, but okay. David Mitchell, I get, I mean, that opening of Cloud Atlas, it's almost like he could have done an opening like one of yours where just everything is happening at once. But
Norman Mailer. Yeah. No, let's get into it. You will understand the Norman Mailer influence if you were to read my first book and then my second book back to back. So Last Night in Montreal, I stand behind that book. It was my first novel. I was figuring out how to write. I think I did the thing that a lot of beginning writers fall into where you kind of know you can write. So you sort of like show off a little bit. It's like, look at my pretty convoluted, extremely ornate sentences. Aren't they lovely? And like, yeah, maybe they're lovely, but they have to be that complicated. So that was Last Night in Montreal. And then after I wrote that book, I read Norman Mailer's novel, The Executioner's Song. I find Mailer pretty hit or miss as a writer. Some of his stuff I think is great and some of it isn't for me. The Executioner's Song, I haven't gone back and read it, but I experienced it at the time as just kind of a miracle of lucidity, clarity, and sparseness. This incredibly pared down. It almost reads like a poem somehow, a little bit fragmentary, incredibly clear and sharp and simple. And that changed the way I write reading that book. So all the books that followed, I stopped striving for a kind of ornate Nabokovian, I mispronounced it, beauty, and started to go for something where the beauty was the clarity and the simplicity. So yeah, that book had a profound influence on me as a writer.
Okay, let's talk about the simplicity for a second because Sage Westfall wants to know, the layout of the book is so elegant. Did you write that with chapter progression / regression in mind, or did you write a much messier first draft and then shape it into that final, almost pyramid-like form?
Usually I write an incredibly messy first draft and then shape it into some semblance of order. With this book, I wanted to use a structure that was an homage to David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas. We keep coming back to him. That novel has that wonderful symmetrical structure, where it starts from way back in the far past and moves to the far future and then kind of boomerangs all the way back to the past. And I'd always wanted to try that. With a totally unrelated story, but the same structure. I tried it with The Glass Hotel. It was a disaster. I had to restructure that book 3 times. But I was able to make it work with Sea of Tranquility. Something about the time traveler moving forward and then back made that work for me. I didn't quite pull it off. That last chapter, The Anomaly, is it's anomalous both in terms of structure and plot, but I got pretty close. So yeah, it was the first book where I'd ever known where it was going in.
Wait, seriously? This is the
Yeah.
first one out of 6?
Yeah. Yeah. Usually I have no idea what the structure is going to be.
Okay.
Although actually, let me walk that back a little bit because I didn't know that Gasperi was the violinist. So I guess I didn't
Mhm.
quite know the ending, but I knew what the structure was going to be for the first time ever.
Do you start with a lot of your books? Do you start with different fragments from characters that you know, or do you start more with the plot and build the characters around the action?
The plot. Yeah,
Plot.
like with Station 11, I remember just having a premise. What if
Yeah.
an actor died on stage in the fourth act of Lear? And then Glass Hotel, I think it always opened with a woman falling off the side of a container ship.
So we're bumping up against actual time, and we are not time travelers. So I want to come back to the simulation hypothesis for a second because Gasperi has this line, "A life lived in a simulation is still a life,"
Yeah,
which I have to say I agree with.
me too. I'll stand behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. But what's your definition of a life well lived, Emily and Shannon?
Do you want to go first, Shannon?
Oh man. Well, yes, because I don't want to follow the eloquence that is you speaking. So
But this is the art of the panel, ladies and gentlemen. I'm listening to what she says while I formulate an eloquent thought.
yes. For me, and this is, obviously my career is in being around things that I love and around people who love the same things that I love, which is reading and experiencing worlds. I think a life well lived is doing something that fulfills you. And whether that is with the people around you or with the activities you're doing or solitude or nature, that it can mean, honestly, an entirely different thing to each individual person. And that's the beauty of a life well lived, is that it's different for every single person.
I love that. And I totally agree with it. Yeah, it's doing the things you love and helping people, like trying to not just make the world a better place than you found it, but can you make the people you know better somehow? Like, lift them up. You're going to be much more eloquent than I am with this question. Yeah, it's being good to people and taking care. Like being careful in your actions and thoughts and doing the things you love, trying to improve the world.
Yeah, it's taking care and being kind, even when the world is ending.
Yeah, exactly.
Even when it feels like the world is ending, because maybe sometimes the world isn't ending when it feels like it's ending. But
or it's always ending, but you got to be kind anyway.
And there's still going to be a new world to come up after it.
Yeah.
That's the thing we can't lose sight of, that there's always going to be another world. And, I wouldn't mind visiting the moon someday, maybe. I'm
into it. That was a beautiful world. But yeah.
Some pretty nice architecture, some pretty spiff architecture and things like that.
It's important.
So, hey, before I let you go though, what's next? Because Sea of Tranquility is going to come to the screen with Patrick Summerville.
Yes,
right?
So is the Glass Hotel.
Okay, good. So let's talk about this.
Yeah, sure. So if I seem a little strung out, this is my 4th hour of Zoom because I spent 3 hours with Patrick Somerville and our colleagues figuring out the break at the Glass Hotel. It's been really fun trying to figure out how to bring that to the screen. We're envisioning it as a mini series. There are a lot of links to the Station 11 series and links to Sea of Tranquility, and it's going to be amazing. So yeah, I've been working on that, and I'm back and forth from LA all the time on that project. And then Sea of Tranquility, we haven't figured out anything about it yet, but it's just kind of lined up in the wings behind it.
Fair enough. And hey, most of our audience actually has not yet seen the HBO adaptation of Station 11, and most of them did come to you. 65% of our audience, Station 11 was their first Emily St. John Mandel.
That doesn't surprise me. That was the book that people read.
It was also a BNN Discover pick. So, like I said, we've been fond of you for more than a minute.
I appreciate that.
But thank you so much for making the time. And readers, I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but as you can imagine, we had lots of questions too. So thank you everyone for joining us. This was great. Emily, we cannot wait to see what comes next. Books, film, whatever it is, we're totally here for it. So thank you.
Thank
Everyone,
you so
have
much.
a great afternoon.
Thanks,
Bye.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.